It will be a whole country effort, is how Kier Starmer has described the way we as a country move forward now when it comes to defending our nation and being part of NATO and defending its members as well. There's a lot to dig down into, which I will do in just a moment with Aggie Chambray, LBC's political correspondent. And just to let you know that the Prime Minister is still taking questions in the Commons. Currently, Sir Ed Davey of the Liberal Democrats, leader of the Liberal Democrats, is giving his response to what's just been announced on defence spending. So we'll keep a listening ear across all of that and bring you any highlights from it. First, let's just hear a little of what Sir Kier Starmer was saying, and we'll hear as well from Kemi Badenoch. Let's listen to a little of what was said.
Starting today, I can announce this government will begin the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War. Yeah. We will deliver our commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, but we will bring it forward so that we reach that level in 2027. And we will maintain that for the rest of this Parliament. And let me spell that out, Mr. Speaker. That means spending £13.4 billion more on defence every year from 2027.
Now, you don't need me to tell you that £13.4 billion more every year is a heck of a lot of money. It's not far behind the figure of the so-called black hole that they found when they took over from the Conservatives. So we'll talk about that with Aggie in just a few moments. He also pointed out that intelligence and security spending, separate from defence spending, would be given a boost as well, bringing the overall increase to 2.6% by 2027. Again, we'll get much more detail on all of that from Aggie. But let's listen to what Sir Kier Starmer had to say about overseas aid in all of this.
It can only be funded through hard choices. And in this case, that means we will cut our spending on development assistance, moving from 0.5% of GNI today to 0.3% in 2027, fully funding our increased investment in defence. I want to be clear to the House. That is not an announcement I am happy to make. I'm proud of our pioneering record on overseas development, and we will continue to play a key humanitarian role in Sudan, in Ukraine, and in Gaza, tackling climate change, supporting multinational efforts on global health and challenges like vaccination. In recent years, the development budget was redirected towards asylum backlogs, paying for hotels. So as we're clearing that backlog at a record pace, there are efficiencies that will reduce the need to cut spending on our overseas programmes.
And this is part, anyway, of Kemi Badenoch's reaction to the announcement.
Can the Prime Minister say in confidence that 2.7%, the 2.5% by 2027 is sufficient? Because we need to look at exactly how we fund this. He must not raise taxes further, as it will destroy our economy. We need a strong economy to pay for strong defence. He cannot borrow more. We are already spending more on debt interest than defence. We all know that he must make difficult decisions on spending. He has our support to do that. In his statement, the Prime Minister also told us about his new value for money defence reform and efficiency plan. Does he agree that the first thing that must be looked at is spending billions of taxpayer money leasing back a defence base on Diego Garcia that we currently own? Why is the Prime Minister still pursuing this deal? Can the Prime Minister say in confidence that 2.7%, the 2.5% by 2027 is sufficient? Because we need to look at exactly how we fund this. He must not raise taxes further, as it will destroy our economy. We need a strong economy to pay for strong defence. He cannot borrow more. We are already spending more on debt interest than defence. We all know that he must make difficult decisions on spending. He has our support to do that. In his statement, the Prime Minister also told us about his new value for money defence reform and efficiency plan. Does he agree that the first thing that must be looked at is spending billions of taxpayer money leasing back a defence base on Diego Garcia that we currently own. Why is the Prime Minister still pursuing this deal?
Right, so bringing in politics very quickly into all of that, wasn't she? She also mentioned the welfare bill. We'll get on to that in just a moment. But try to just describe for us, if you would, Aggie Chambray, LBC's political correspondent in the studio with me, the context and the significance of this moment.
Well, I think the significance is huge. I'll just say that firstly, just to remind everyone very briefly. Labour had promised already to get to 2.5%, but they hadn't put a timeline on that. We were expecting the timeline shortly through the Strategic Defence Review. But the context is Kier Starmer felt he just could not sit next to Donald Trump on Thursday in the White House and not have put a timeline on defence. Donald Trump, of course, wants European leaders to pay more. He wants them to get to 5%. 2.5% is not 5%, but it is a timeline to get to more. 3% he promised at some stage in the next parliament as well, which is a really big deal. I mean, you mentioned the numbers there, but £13.4 billion more on defence every year from 2027. That's before you get to the 3%. So we are talking really, really huge amounts of money when the government doesn't have a huge amount of money at all. And I think the language that Kier Starmer used towards the beginning of the statement, where he talked about the reasons for this, saying instability will always wash up on our shore. Russia is a menace in our waters, on our streets, and if we don't deliver lasting peace, instability will only grow. Those are the words of someone who feels they have absolutely no choice but to increase defence spending. And it's something he doesn't want to do. It's something the Chancellor doesn't want to do. And yet you have the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, sitting next to him nodding because, again, she knows there is no choice. And to get to that number, they are going to cut the foreign aid budget, which, he has immediately set out how he is going to fund this huge uptick in funding.
I thought it was interesting that when he first announced that, he described it as development assistance. And I was, I've been doing this for years, and I was thinking, what's development assistance? What does he mean? Does he mean foreign aid? Because if he means foreign aid, that's a big story. And he does mean foreign aid or overseas aid, but he even sort of euphemistically described it.
Yes.
Maybe to soften the blow, I don't know.
Perhaps to soften the blow, although everyone figured it out pretty quickly.
Very quickly,
yes,
yeah.
Indeed. So he kind of immediately explained how he was going to pay for it, and then set out a number of other plans that they have to kind of make to reform defence, to make it more efficiency led. But I think the language, I talked about Donald Trump a second ago, the language around Britain has stood up to be counted, demonstrated strength, and that is what our country needs now. Now, that language sounds a little bit like language that is immediately aimed at Donald Trump, the President of the United States, to hear. We have demonstrated strength. We too we have strength as a partner, and talked about the US being kind of the most important bilateral partner for the UK as well. So I think we just cannot be under any illusion that every single bit of this announcement is aimed at Donald Trump, because in 2 days' time he is going to sit next to him, and he just wants to get the most he can possibly get out of that meeting. That includes on Ukraine, but that also includes on tariffs.
And NATO.
On NATO, on tariffs, on the Chagos Islands deal as well, which Kemi Badenoch, of course, mentioned. That deal is currently sitting with the US. There's an awful lot he needs out of this meeting, and I think he felt there was no choice but to have this already agreed by the time he went into that meeting.
He also talked in 2 or 3 points in that announcement about, obviously the tough stuff is the extra spending to sort of sell to people, but he also talked about developing our security apparatus and our security world can and should have economic benefits too. He was talking about the nature of warfare has changed. That's clear from the battleground in Ukraine, he said, I think accurately. Because I presume he's referring there to the higher tech end of things in war, drones and other stuff. But the reality of that Ukraine war, though, is that it's almost like the age of the drone meets 1914 again, isn't it? It's a bizarre combination of things, that war in Ukraine. But that's kind of by the by to the speech. But he talked there about being a leader in NATO, all of that military development, we should be welcoming it. It is good for our country and will be good for our economy. It kind of better had be, or we're stuffed, aren't we, economically?
It kind of Better had be, yes. But also, I think he sort of has to say that because the government has been so clear that the number one mission for them is growth. So if he went about this and said, look, this isn't going to be good for our economy, but we have to do it anyway, I think that would be an even trickier sell for people than this is, because he's essentially saying to people, this is going to be difficult, but we have to do it. So I think he has to say, and also it's going to be good for growth. But you're right, there were other things in that speech as well, talking about the fact that he says the UK will reject any false choice between the US and Europe, and essentially saying, yes, the US is really important, but doing that bilateral dance again, sort of saying, but we also need to be very close to Europe as well. And it also talked about the need for deterrence. But I think also, Sheila, if I could just return to that defence spending number, I think it's interesting that he said we're going to raise to 2.5%, but technically, if you include the fact that we are going to be spending more on intelligence and security services too, that's going to be at 2.6%. And I think that number is interesting because that's very, very close to the number that Tony Radakin, who is the chief of the defence staff, and the respective heads of the Army, RAF and Royal Navy, they all called for spending to be raised to 2.65%. Right. So he's coming very close to that figure. He's not getting to that figure, but coming close to that figure in the way that he's pulling everything together. I'm not sure they will accept pulling that together on top of the 2.5%, but I thought that was interesting.
I mean, this isn't the end of the conversation, is it, by any means? This is the initial, as you say, sort of preparing the pitch for Thursday as much as anything else. But funding it and funding maybe even more as time goes on, where does that leave other choices? Kemi Badenoch saying you can't raise taxes anymore. Well, they might. You can't borrow anymore. She looked at the Chagos deal. She also mentioned welfare, didn't she? We didn't play that bit, but she also mentioned the welfare bill. But we've heard rumours already of 11% cuts being asked for in each government department. I mean, is this going to be the hook on which those cuts hang?
Well, I think it will be part of it, yes. I think that 11% figure is actually right, at least at the moment. And you know that things in the Treasury are a removable feast ahead of any big fiscal event. But, I mean, I was speaking to somebody in the Treasury late last week who basically said to me, we will always prefer and do prefer spending cuts over tax rises. And so we are making decisions because the world has changed. Those are words that Rachel Reeves also said towards the end of last week. The world has changed. And, they acknowledge that. And so I think they do realise that they are going to have to put in some serious spending cuts. And yes, this is part of it, with the foreign aid budget being cut to 2.3% from 2.5%. But there's more than that. And defence isn't the only area that they're having to pour more money into and spend in terms of not having real terms cuts. And we know the economy is not in a great place. So I think it's going to be a really, really, really difficult fiscal event. And I think this will have made it more difficult.
I was struck right from the beginning, though, about that turn of phrase, this will be a whole society effort. So he began the speech with a kind of, let's remember who we are, referring back to Attlee, Bevan, previous generations in war and that kind of thing. A whole society effort. That says there's more to come, doesn't it? And it will affect all of us.
It's almost a sort of call to action, isn't it? You're all going to feel this, yeah. every one of you, and I think that is incredibly striking, and it does feel like a serious shift in language and a real sort of moment, I suppose, and basically saying to everyone, this is going to affect you all, but as we've talked about already, there was nothing else we could do. I
mean, coming off the back of COVID, the Ukraine war and what that did to people's economic lives, and we're talking about energy bills today, and I know it's for a different reason now, but that was part of people's experience, cost of living crisis. That it's not just in the UK people are experiencing that, of course, but we'll focus on the UK. If what he's saying in gentle code is a lot more pain to come, that's not great, is it? At the beginning of a newish government now, anyway. And a country that is on its knees a bit. I mean, and I'm a bit I try to be a bit Pollyanna-ish so that people don't listen to the radio every day in despair. But there's a lot to despair about, and there's a lot to worry about. And I wonder how they're going to, as political leaders, keep buoyant and keep people buoyant in all of this.
I wonder too, but I think the point is they have to, because I think there is some acknowledgement from some government figures that I've spoken to that they got it wrong at the beginning in their tone. They were relentlessly negative when they got into office. And I think they regret that, or at least some people regret that. And they want to draw a line under that. But the reason that they did that was this sort of bringing out the body's effort to say this isn't our fault, nothing we're doing is our fault because of this humongous black hole.
That's a really good way of describing it.
But I think they would acknowledge that they took it a little bit too far, and I think they do want some positivity. One minister texted me when Kier Starmer was in the middle of making that now infamous speech in the Rose Garden that was relentlessly depressing and said, but where's the hope? Yeah. And I think they get that now. But if there is more, and you've pointed out there, it's a sort of slightly more guarded way of saying there is more to come, this is going to get worse. But I think it's very difficult to balance those two things while saying it's going to get worse, just to give you a heads up, while also being positive. And I think that's part of this is going to affect every part of society, trying to sort of say we're doing this, but we have to, stay positive.
I'm a great believer that, I know these are really serious things, but if you look at Ukraine as an example, where they are at war, we're talking about spending to be ready for a war if it ever came, but also to be secure now. And security, of course, allows for economic development, allows for lives to thrive and all of those good things. But if you look at Ukraine and the positivity that Ukrainians are still managing, positivity and optimism isn't the same as delusion, is it? And I think sometimes people confuse. I know I'm going off at a bit of a non-political tangent here, but I think if they're going to start giving speeches like this on a regular basis, it's not that far removed from all of that, because we do need to be buoyant as a country to get back on our feet, and individuals need to be buoyant. And we look at the mental health toll in this country. We look at the people out of work and the toll that takes on them, let alone on the economic strength of the country. There's a lot that needs optimism, isn't there? Despite the difficulties.
I think that's right, and I think that's something probably the government does acknowledge. I mean, it's not really right to compare COVID to the Ukraine war, especially not for people living in Ukraine.
But it's just the one after the other element of it all.
Yes, but there was a certain amount of positivity during COVID. Everyone went outside their homes on a Thursday night and banged their saucepans, if I remember rightly.
And looked out for their neighbours.
And looked out for their neighbours. So I think you can have that kind of national pride even when something horrible is going on. And as you say, that is something that happens in Ukraine too, where there is a certain amount of positivity. Zelensky always seems positive even when he's delivering terrible news. So and
also when people are living through these dreadful things, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in Sudan, they somehow mostly manage to carry on, or at least try to carry on living. So that is, quite a speech, bringing forward what he was already aiming for on spending, but it makes a big difference, that 13.4 billion, doesn't it? That's a big deal.
And bringing it forward sooner. I think the Conservatives, when they were in office during their final term, had said that they would get to 2.5% by 2030. So the implication was that Labour, the reason they hadn't put a timestamp on it was because it was going to be further away than 2030. So 2027 is much sooner than lots and lots of people predicted.